Everybody's talking about this book. It's called Hymns of the Far North, and you can get it once you finish maxing out exploration on Hiisi Island. The book's a real who's who in terms of ancient Teyvat. I mean, it talks about Nibelung, the Heavenly Principles, the Shades, the First Angel, the Voyager, and the Third Descender, among others. And let's just say it's pretty rare to get all those names in one place at the same time. But all these celebrities don't go by the names that we're familiar with. They all have names that relate to Finnish folklore. And investigating the origins of these names allows us to draw some very interesting connections. And one of those connections involves the identity of the Third Descender. Now look, I know a lot of people have already figured this out for themselves and have made posts and videos about it, so there's a pretty good chance you already know who the Third Descender is. So you probably don't need me rehashing all the things you already know. Plus, that would be really boring of me, and I do not like boring. Besides, I'm pretty sure you guys come to this channel for deep dives into mythology and crackpot theories, and it would be very remiss of me not to give you exactly what you came for. So today, I will indeed be talking about the Third Descender's identity, but I would like to do so while also making the case that the Third Descender's identity has also been passed down throughout the ages like one of Natlan's ancient names. And this fact alone can tell us a lot about what the Tsaritsa's true motives are and what Project Stuzha really is. Of course, we can't get all this information just from one book. We're also gonna have to look a bit more closely at the story of Reed Miller and the legend of the Sampo. And that is how I intend to trick you into dipping your toes into the deep well of Finnish mythology, because in these parts, we like learning. Whether my theories end up holding water or not, I am determined to expose you to new knowledge in some way, shape, or form, against your will if I must. And here comes a different kind of potentially new knowledge for you to acquire. You can save dollars by switching your primo purchasing to Loot Bar. Okay, bad transition. But they are the sponsor of today's video, so let me tell you about them. Loot Bar is a third-party top-up shop where you can get in-game currency at a great price. Now, I know a lot of people feel very anxious about using third-party top-up sites because they seem a little too good to be true, right? Surely those discounts come with a side effect of malware or something? I know this feeling very well because I've been there recently, and I'm very happy to report that after having tested many of these services, Loot Bar is definitely my top-up shop of choice. And I'm not just saying that because they're a sponsor. I used Loot Bar for my last giveaway, and I'll do it again because Loot Bar is both secure and reliable, and they have a 24/7 live chat support, nearly 25,000 excellent reviews on Trustpilot, and a full refund guarantee if something goes wrong with your transaction. Plus, they only use publicly available information like your user ID and server region to top up your account, so there's no login credentials required. And as an extra level of convenience, Loot Bar offers a handy pack bundling service for whales and dolphins. You don't have to buy each pack individually anymore. And as an additional bonus, Loot Bar takes advantage of regional pricing to get you those sweet, sweet discounts. Those can really add up, especially on larger purchases. Plus, if you're new to Loot Bar, you'll receive some bonus coupons for some additional discounts. To learn more, click the link in the description or visit lootbar.gg for details. A big thanks to Loot Bar for sponsoring this video, and remember guys, discounts are awesome, but please spend responsibly. Alright, so where were we? That's right. Reed Miller, Project Stuzha, and the Sampo. Well, I'm ready to get things started, but do note before we begin that most of the in-game content I'm going to be referencing will come from world quests rather than the Archon quest. So please make sure you check the spoiler warnings in the description box lest you spoil yourselves on a good time. Oh, and just to make this video a little bit more special, please welcome our guest editor for today, fellow lore tuber and awesome buddy of mine, Roosevelt. I have smartly given her free reign to do whatever the heck she wants, so have fun, Rosie. A link to her channel will be in the description box, so if you're not subscribed to her already, you should be. Go over there. Like, you can pause the video and go over there right now and come back. It's okay. I'll wait. You done? Okay, great. Now, without further ado, let's dive right on into it, shall we? For all my weird takes to make sense, you kind of need to know what a Sampo is both in-game and in Finnish mythology. So let's start with the Finnish myth, since that's the Sampo's origin. The story of the Sampo is most famously found in the Finnish epic, the Kalevala. In the myth, a magic bard named Väinämöinen traveled to the northern lands of Pohjola, where he became indebted to its ruler, the witch, Louhi. She demands he repay her kindness by forging her a device that doesn't exist yet called the Sampo. She says it's a magic hand mill that's capable of creating infinite grain, gold, and salt. And she'll even let him marry her daughter if he succeeds. But Wainamoinen doesn't have the skills to forge the Sampo, so he asks the legendary blacksmith Ilmarinen to do it instead, promising him Louhi's daughter in exchange. So Ilmarinen travels to Pohjola and successfully forges the Sampo. But when he tries to get his reward, Louhi's daughter refuses to marry him, and Louhi refuses to share the Sampo's generated wealth with either him or Wainamoinen. So of course, Wainamoinen and Ilmarinen are pissed, so they team up with another hero who had also been wronged by Louhi once before, Lemminkainen, and together they conspire to steal the Sampo back. But as the three men struggle to seize the Sampo back from Louhi and her people, the Sampo flies off into the water and sinks beneath the sea, where it churns salt for the rest of eternity. Because apparently none of them were able to figure out how to retrieve the Sampo from the bottom of the ocean. And that's basically the short version of the original myth, and we're definitely going to come back to it later. Now, the Sampo also exists in Genshin as the Subatomic Assembling Mass Energy Patterning Orb, or Sampo for short. This thing can essentially reconstruct matter at a subatomic level or transmute matter into raw energy, so it's both an object of creation and also potentially a weapon. This Sampo device was made thousands of years ago by Nibelung's space buddy Voyager, who in Hymns the Far North goes by the name Soidervoinen. Soidervoinen is another name for the Finnish god of vegetation and agriculture, Samsa Pellervoinen, or Samsa for short. Now you may recall that Samsa was not the one who created the Sampo. Ilmarinen the blacksmith was, so it does feel a little bit strange that Voyager is named after Samsa and is also credited with making Genshin's version of the Sampo. This isn't as arbitrary of a decision as it appears to be on the surface, since as the god of vegetation, Samsa was said to sometimes take the grain produced by the Sampo and use it to sow the land. This isn't something that's found in the Kalevala, it comes from other sources, but still. Now, Voyager's version of the Sampo was actually left in the care of the Hyperborean moon children who eventually became the Frost Moon Scions. After a celestial nail destroyed their golden city of Hyperborea, these moon children took the device with them and migrated south to Nod-Krai on the dying Frost Moon's instructions. And they did so because they believed that one day an heir with sacred blood who could awaken and control the Sampo would be born among their number, and that sacred heir would use the Sampo to usher in a brand new golden age of prosperity for them, in Elysium like the lost Hyperborea. The Frost Moon Scions also believed that the sacred heir born to them would possess the purest of sacred blood, and for that reason the priesthood secretly implemented rigorous rules around marriage and labeled those rules as rituals the faithful must adhere to, although the truth behind these rituals remained a secret. This controlled marriage project was appropriately named the Sacred Heir Project. But there was just one problem with this project. Voyager's Sampo was missing its control module, and the knowledge required to make a replacement had been lost in Hyperborea's fall. So even if the sacred heir was born as the prophecy foretold, they wouldn't be able to interface with the Sampo at all. So the archpriestess of the time decided to seal the Sampo away for good, and discontinued the Sacred Heir Project. 13 generations later, the blessing of the Frost Moon goddess the Frost Moon Scions had come to rely on started to wane. Determined to see her people flourish, the high priestess of the time, Lovia, another name for the witch Louhi, revived the Sacred Heir Project, knowing full well that the control module was missing and that without it, there was no point in having a sacred heir. But that didn't matter to Lovia, because Lovia had a plan, and an accomplice named Rotwang. Rotwang was originally a researcher from Conria's Universitas Magistrorum who had been exiled to Devat on account of his research into the Abyss being considered far too dangerous. He eventually ended up in Snezhnaya, where he continued his research under the Bel Yisar. Rotwang, like Lovia, also wished to create a new Elysium. Only his idea of Elysium lay in the Abyss. Still, the two decided to conspire together to find a way to awaken the Sampo. Now, Rotwang was likely interested in leveraging the Sampo's lost technology to further his own research, while Lovia likely wanted to take advantage of Rotwang's skills to create a new control module for it. So while he worked on that, Lovia could focus on producing the sacred heir. But her plans went awry when the woman who was supposed to bear the sacred child eloped with an outsider who she was not permitted to marry. Lovia pursued and captured the couple, intending to bring the woman back alive. But the woman slit her own throat out of grief after her lover was brutally murdered in front of her. This completely ruined Lovia's plans, so she turned to the quote, lesser branches of the bloodline and selected a pair of twins to perform her own experiments on, Ayla and Alia. If she couldn't purify the blood through controlled marriage, then she would purify the blood through, making them drink the silver blood of other scions. That's not explicitly stated anywhere, but the context clues go kinda hard. Anyway, Alia eventually ran away, leaving Isla behind to bear all the responsibility, although Isla's notes actually say that Alia didn't run away, she was abducted by a man instead. That'll be an important detail for later, but this is the moment where Reed Miller enters the picture. Reed Miller's origins are never expanded upon because the guy is essentially a living myth. It's very difficult to parse what feats belong to the original Reed Miller and which belong to those who carried on his legacy or performed deeds in his name. And I'm not even sure that's his real name, but we'll talk about that in a minute. Now, despite this lack of clarity on his origins, based on this novel about him and bits of fractured lore that I've scrounged up from all over the place, I think I have a fairly clear-ish picture of what went down here. So you remember how I said Alia didn't run away? She was abducted? Well, I think the man that abducted her may have been the Grand Duke Photius, a fae that's loyal to Rotwang. The way I see it, Rotwang likely wanted his own sacred heir to activate the Sampo without having to deal with Lovia. He may have also unsealed the Sampo. I say that because the novel starts out with the Sampo being stolen from the Frostmoon Scions and taken to the governor's palace. This is what prompts Reed Miller to conspire to steal the Sampo during the governor's ball. But instead of stealing the Sampo, he targets the Fae governor's adopted daughter, who's actually a Frostmoon Scion, and who I think is potentially the kidnapped Alia. Similar stories are echoed in the Weapons Master Key and Snare Hook as well. What happens after this is a little bit murky, because it takes place after the novel ends. But what we do know is that Reed Miller did eventually end up successfully stealing the Sampo, but he was caught and later propositioned by Rotwang, who invited Miller to join him in building an Abyssal Elysium, but Miller refused, and then faked his own execution and vanished from history. Don't question it yet, we're gonna come back to this. We also know that Alia died somehow trying to stop Rotwang, but she managed to enlist the help of Reed Miller's friend Solveig, founder of the Lightkeepers, before she passed on. Solveig and Isla managed to form a partnership, which created the perfect opportunity for Isla to put a stop to Lovia's plans with murder. That was a lot of information to take in, I know, but you guys are starting to see the parallels between the story I just told and the myth of the Sampo, right? Some magical device of infinite prosperity is stolen from the hands of an ill-intentioned woman who uses her daughter as leverage to obtain the device's power, and then there's a thief who prevents anyone from using the Sampo ever again, among some other little details. Good, because these connections and stories are all the context you need to understand why I think Reed Miller is connected to the third Descender, who I realize I haven't talked about at all yet. That's okay, we're getting there, just stick with me. Now, I'm gonna make a bold claim. I think that Reed Miller was the sacred heir of the Sampo that the Frostmoon Scions were waiting for. Now, I don't know how long it took Lovia to track down the original Frostmoon Scion mother, but I suspect it was long enough for her to give birth, because there are so many flashing red arrows pointing at Reed Miller that I'm not sure how the sacred heir could be anyone else. Take his name, for example, Reed Miller. A reed is just another name for a grass, and grains come from grasses, and the Sampo produces grain. And then we have his last name, Miller, a miller of grains. It's a grain mill. The Sampo was also a hand mill, a grain mill. And this is part of why I say Reed Miller probably wasn't his real name. It's just an alias based on the story of the Sampo. Wordplay of his name aside, I want to point out that Miller here also had his own dream of creating an Elysium, and that's what the sacred heir was supposed to use the Sampo for, creating an Elysium. Of course, Reed Miller's Elysium was nothing like the ones that Lovia and Rotwang wanted, because all he wanted to do was create a world without boundaries, a world based on freedom. Plus, if you think of Reed Miller as the sacred heir of the Sampo, then Rotwang's proposition to him makes sense. Rotwang may have needed Reed Miller in order to operate the Sampo. That's why he offered Reed Miller a partnership to forge a new Elysium together. Now, I know that someone is inevitably going to point out the fact that only powerful Frostmoon Scions can technically interact with the Sampo, like it's their power and rituals that get it to work, which is why they were trying to, purify their bloodline in order to make a sacred heir in the first place. And the Sacred Heir Project notes do use female pronouns when referring to the sacred heir, so it doesn't really make sense for him to be the sacred heir, to which I would agree, actually. I do not think that Reed Miller was the intended or even the expected result of the project. I think the Frostmoon Scions were aiming for someone more like Lauma, although there are several mentions of a king of this Elysium, which Reed Miller obviously is, and we'll get to that in a minute. I'm personally making the assumption that the Sacred Heir and the king are the same because they do seem to have a ton of overlap, but if you don't agree with that, that's okay. Just know that that's my assumption. I'm also very convinced that his mother was a Frost Moon Scion, perhaps even the one who was supposed to bear the Sacred Heir in the first place, but eloped with a Snezhnayan outlander. This is partly because it works with him being an unblessed heir, which we're going to talk about in a second, and partly because he chose a raven as his symbol. This may not feel very important, but in Finnish folklore, the raven was born of Lempo and Hiisi, Lempo being a deity associated with love and blacksmithing, hence the blackened feathers, and Hiisi being the name for either a location full of sacred creatures like the Fae or a deity of the Fae or a type of Fae. Considering the fact that the Frost Moon Scions live on Hiisi Island and basically everyone else lives on Lempo, I think the raven insignia is actually a quite clever nod to his heritage. Taking another look at the novel reveals one more potential link to the ravens of Finnish folklore, because on occasion, a raven's egg will produce a magic stone called a raven stone, which grants the raven special powers like invisibility, the perfect ability for a thief. Now, not only is there a sort of magic-looking stone on Reed Miller's insignia, but the novel puts a heavy emphasis on a gemstone that Reed Miller tampered with in order to steal the governor's daughter, the one controlling the Sampo. This is pretty convincing evidence for me, and we're definitely going to come back to it later, but all of this is still very circumstantial. The thing that really sells the idea to me comes from the aurate radiance of the Far North Scion's weapon ascension material, and I'm going to read the whole description verbatim because this entire thing matters. With the unblessed birth of the prophesied son, a millennia-long plan ushered in a bleak twilight. A scheme born of cunning was shattered by foolish betrayal. The youth who was supposed to be king took the maid who was supposed to serve him and stole the secret treasure that was supposed to be his, only to reject the crowns that fate had ordained for him. In time, the king who was destined to rule Elysium went down in history as an unpardonable thief. And by the time the true new moon shone upon the land, the Far North's final wish of golden grandeur had already been buried by a priestess who had never believed in any god in the empty grave of her king. So it starts out by identifying the existence of a sacred heir of prophecy and confirms that they were from an unblessed birth, which I've taken to mean that they were not born as a result of the Sacred Heir project, or at least that they were born outside the Frost Moon Scion's clan. And then it claims that this heir found and stole the woman who was supposed to serve him. This is who I think is the Frost Moon Scion Alia, the one that was abducted by Rotwang. And then it says that the heir stole the treasure that was supposed to be his, which should be the Sampo, but he decided not to use it. Now, the last part heavily implies that the Sacred Heir is Reed Miller because he was both the unpardonable thief and a king who left behind an empty grave. These are both attributes of Reed Miller and Reed Miller alone. I think you get why I'm so convinced of this. And if Reed Miller is the Sacred Heir the way I think he is, then it really explains why he's so prevalent throughout the entirety of Nod-Krai. He is way more important than just the founder of the treasure hoarders. Now, after faking his death, Reed Miller appears to have chartered a ship and sailed to the northern seas, either looking for or hiding something rather important. And I'm pretty sure that this thing that he hid is the proof of Cognoscenti. As of time of recording, we only have access to 3 out of the 5 proofs, but I'm pretty sure getting all 5 will somehow lead us to what's left of the Sampo. In fact, I kind of suspect that the Cognoscenti might be referring to the Sampo's missing control module, because the word means specialized knowledge. Plus, it would make sense if Reed Miller wanted to hide the control module to ensure that no one would use the Sampo for evil. He could certainly have just destroyed it, but I think he may have been worried that one day the Sampo's powers might be required for Nod-Krai's survival, so he wanted to just leave the option open but make sure that it just wasn't easily accessible. Not to change the subject, but a thief on a ship is just a pirate, and I find that really funny, seeing how years ago I made this one video about the treasure hoarders and their connections with Kaya, and Kaya's grandpa was a pirate. It's kind of funny to look back on those old theories now with all this new information, it really is. Because that pirate connection creates a very interesting web of other connections that lead us straight to the third descender. What, you thought I forgot about that? Not a chance. We're just now getting to the fun part of this theory, because the name of the third descender found in Hymns of the Far North is one lifted straight from the Kalevala's myth of the Sampo, and that name is Saarelainen. Now, Saarelainen is unlikely to be the third descender's real name, but we can learn a lot from the name regardless. On the surface, the name actually has little meaning beyond its literal translation of islander. But in the Kalevala, the name Ahti Saarelainen was another name for the hero Lemminkainen. You might remember him from the ending of the Sampo myth that I shared at the start of this video. Lemminkainen is not just some side character, he actually features quite prominently in the Kalevala, and one of his more interesting and relevant stories takes place shortly after a disheartened Ilmarinen and Vainamoinen leave the Sampo behind on Pohjola with Louhi. This time it's Lemminkainen's turn to travel to the northern lands of Pohjola and fall prey to Louhi's schemes. And just like she did with Vainamoinen and Ilmarinen, Louhi promises Lemminkainen her daughter's hand in marriage if he manages to complete some tasks for her. One of these tasks is killing the black swan floating on the River of Death, but he was murdered while trying to hunt the swan down and his body was cut into pieces which sank into the bottom of the River of Death. When his mother found out about her son's grisly fate, she went to Pohjola herself, dredged up his bits from the bottom of the river, and pieced him back together. The resurrected Lemminkainen was pissed and decided he wanted revenge against Louhi, especially since she ended up marrying her daughter off to someone else while he was dead. So he kills Louhi's husband in retaliation, and that sparks an ongoing feud between Louhi and Lemminkainen. So that's why, when the opportunity presented itself, Lemminkainen joined Ilmarinen and Vainamoinen on their quest to steal the Sampo back from Louhi. And I'm sure by now you've noticed a few parallels between Lemminkainen and the third descender, right? Like how both of them had their bodies split into pieces? Alright, I admit that's a pretty loose connection on its own, but what if we extrapolate a little bit with that? Lemminkainen's mother collected his remains in order to resurrect him, and we know that the Tsaritsa is collecting the remains of the third descender for an unknown reason, so what if the Tsaritsa is trying to do the same thing as Lemminkainen's mother? Well, I can actually make a pretty compelling case that is exactly what the Tsaritsa is trying to do, so humor me for a moment. According to Hymns of the Far North, the Bel-Yiet Tsar goes by the name Pakasuko. Now, Pakasuko is another name for Dead Miraz, aka Father Frost, and Dead Miraz has a daughter or granddaughter by the name of Snegorotchka the Snow Maiden. Seeing as the Tsaritsa is the daughter of the Bel-Yiet Tsar, then she should also be Snegorotchka. The name Snegorotchka does not appear in Hymns of the Far North, but it does appear in Ballad of the Fjords alongside another familiar name, Ajax, or as I'm going to call him, Aias, lest we get confused with our playable version of Ajax. So Aias is a legendary figure, a hero of Snezhnaya, known for discovering the destroyed city of Hyperborea deep beneath the sea and having a conflict with both a giant whale and a dragon, and perhaps most importantly of all, he's known as the lover of Snegorotchka, which heavily suggests that the original hero, Aias, was the legendary third descender. But you probably know all of this. Not only have I put this in a different video, but it's also the hot topic in the lore space right now, so I'd actually be more surprised if you didn't know about this. And I also think it's not some groundbreaking revelation that the Tsaritsa would want to try and resurrect her dead lover. In fact, even for those who didn't think there was a love thing involved, many people were already suspecting that the Tsaritsa wanted to resurrect the third descender anyway by collecting all of the Gnosis, so why am I telling you things that you probably already know or have been theorizing about for a long time? Well, here's the thing. Aias' story mirrors Lemminkainen's, which makes sense because the two share the epithet of Saarelainen. But Lemminkainen's story is also very reminiscent of Reed Miller's story, especially when it comes to the Sampo. And stranger still, all three stories have elements in common with Child's story, and Child shares a name with Aias. This is actually the reason why I'm using the pronunciation of Aias for the third descender and not Ajax. I thought it might be less confusing that way. Anyway, this made me wonder if the name Aias is actually behaving like one of Natlan's ancient names. Not in terms of all the resurrection stuff, although that theme does seem to be present here, but the inheriting of the story part. Like ancient name bearers in Natlan all seem to share a similar life story or fate. These were never exactly the same, but there were always some core elements that would carry over from bearer to bearer. And I think that's what's going on here with the third descender. All of these inheritors of the third descender's ancient name have some really interesting interesting commonalities. Like how Reed Miller, Aias, and Child are all involved with projects to remake the world. Reed Miller with the Sampo, Child with the Fatui, and Aias because they're a descender and that seems to be what descenders do. There's also a recurring theme of whales, 2 of which are star swallowing. Reed Miller hid one of the proof of Cognoscentis inside of a giant mechanical whale that you have to feed star fruit into, and Child fought a whale that literally swallows stars. And all 3 of these guys are allegedly of noble birth or of noble character. Assuming the 3rd or 4th descenders are alike, then they should both share noble origins as the statues of 7 state. Meanwhile, Reed Miller was supposed to be a king, and Child, well, the code name of Child literally means one born of noble birth. And Reed Miller and Child both joined criminal organizations, with the former being labeled as a thief, and it's quite possible that Aias was also supposed to retrieve or steal something from the Abyss on behalf of Pakasuko, although that's mostly vibes and not actually confirmed. Plus, the secret heir that I accuse Reed Miller of being was supposed to be able to, quote, command the pure, unaltered elemental forces at will, so perhaps that's a reference to wielding all 7 elements at once like the Traveler can. And ultimately, they were supposed to attain fusion with the world, which also seems to be what a Descender is supposed to do, eventually. And in addition to all of the above, all 3 ancient Descender name-bearers have deep connections to a fair maiden of the north. Reed Miller to his Frostmoon Scion priestess, and Aias and Child to the Tsaritsa. And this relationship is frequently romantic, which is really funny to me because in the Kalevala, Lemminkainen, which remember is the inspiration for the 3rd Descender, is the son of Lempo, and Lempo is a deity that's associated with love, especially the negative or destructive aspects of love. And that's one of the reasons why Lemminkainen is sometimes referred to as Loverboy. It's also a pretty close literal translation too, I think. Are there more parallels? Yes. But I would like to pause and draw your attention to another potential Aias that no one seems to have noticed yet. So you remember how Lemminkainen had to retrieve a special swan in order to win the hand of Louhi's daughter, right? That was a pretty important part of the story because that was how he died. And it was this part of the story with the swan that reminded me of the opera Parzival, because in that story, Parzival's son, Lohengrin, rowed a boat pulled by swans in order to rescue a damsel in distress who he later marries, and who he, of course, has a tragic ending with. The fair maiden tragic ending thing seems to be a recurring theme as well. But this set off alarm bells in my head because even though this is a very loose connection, Parsifal is a named character who sure looks a lot like Child. And I've already made a whole video back in 3.5 linking Child to Parsifal, so things are already looking pretty sus, but they're about to get a whole lot sussier because Lemminkainen is typically described as having wavy red hair, just like Parsifal and just like Child. Now, do you think it's a coincidence that Reed Miller also disguises himself as a red-haired footman in his novel in light of this? Because I sure don't. And Parsifal was also a criminal. He became a phantom thief, just like Reed Miller. And just like Reed Miller and Child and Lemminkainen and the 3rd Descender, Parsifal also courted a fair maiden, a blue-eyed spear witch. But let's not forget that both Parsifal and Reed Miller eventually ended up as seafarers or pirates. And that also seems to be where they both met their end, just like how Lemminkainen met his first end at the bottom of the River of Death. In other words, these guys all die in water, although I will argue that in some cases, water is also the abyss. I say that because Lemminkainen died in the River of Death, which is obviously water, but it's also, you know, the River of Death. And that River of Death is located in the frozen northern lands of Pohjola. And Pohjola is what the hymns of the far north call the abyss within the boundaries of Snezhnaya. Now this is probably because in the Kalevala, Pohjola was either the realm of the dead or a land that shared a border with the realm of the dead, which is, again, why the River of Death was there. So to me, the abyss is synonymous with the realm of the dead, or at least with dying, and also with water. So when Child fell into the cracks of the abyss and stayed down there for several months only to come back to the surface very different, you could say he fell into a river of death and was reborn. And that fits with Hymns of the Far North's claim that the 3rd Descender died as a result of opening Pohjola's gates, or rather, opening the gates of the abyss. And if you think I'm being a little silly about equating the abyss to water, don't be too sure. We already know that Natlan's Night Kingdom is considered a sort of watery underworld. And in fact, watery underworlds are far more common mythologically than fiery brimstone ones. Plus, in the Nartzenkreuz questline, you can find this note from Renee, which reads, Io Io Pon, that which lies beneath the great sea. The purpose of this line in the ritual scripture is to forsake the self and sink into the abyss, and in the abyss, to welcome rebirth as a holy infant. Renee is drawing a direct comparison between the Great Sea and the Abyss in this text. And I think this is really important because Renee was trying to make himself into an artificial descender. This text also reveals some of Renee's thoughts and opinions of how the whole descender process works. And I think it's pretty enlightening in context because he seems to be suggesting that sinking beneath the abyss and harnessing its power can make you a descender-like being, or as Renee puts it, one who can rival the will of a world. So there's something about using the abyss as a source of transformation, which may include the death of the self, and once that's been done, that descender-like being could challenge the current order of the world, or in this case, the heavenly principles. With that in mind, given how both the Abyss Twin and the fourth Descender, aka the Traveler, can absorb infinite amounts of abyssal energy into themselves, we could probably assume that Aias had that same ability. So it's not so much that they died because they went into the abyss and opened the gates, but because they were punished by the heavenly principles for doing so. Their body was split into 7 pieces, these gnosis. And that got me wondering if the gnosis are actually considered cursed because of their potential ability to control or attract abyssal power. If so, then that would explain why the Heavenly Principles is called the Lord of the 7 Calamities in Hymns of the Far North, because they made the 7 gnosis, and the 7 gnosis attract calamities, because abyss. And if the Tsaritsa is gathering the gnosis in order to resurrect the third Descender so that they can challenge the Heavenly Principles, then I think it's time we talk about Project Stuzha. So Project Stuzha has only been mentioned once in passing by Arlecchino. She didn't reveal many details about it, just that it's a very important part of the Tsaritsa's plan, but we can still make a few assumptions about it based on the name and the things that are involved. So the name Stuzha just means cold in Russian. It's not a shocking name, the Tsaritsa is the Cryo Archon after all, so this feels pretty predictable. And we know she's gathering the gnosis so that she can challenge the heavenly principles, but I don't think she's interested in just having a change in leadership. I think she wants to make a whole new world, because both Piero and the Tsaritsa talk about burning away the old world, which implies that they intend to make a new one. But for a new world to be made, the old one has to be destroyed, and since she's the Cryo Archon, I think this points to Project Stuzha as being some kind of manufactured apocalypse of the Ice Age variety. But I don't think things end there, because I think Project Stuzha is just phase 1 in an attempt to instigate Ragnarok. Ragnarok is what the Old Norse called a series of cataclysmic natural disasters and wars that led up to the end of the world. And the first sign of Ragnarok's arrival is something called Fimbulvetter, or the Eternal Winter, and that's what I think Project Stuzha is. It's Ragnarok Step 1. Now, Ragnarok is a little bit different from other mythological apocalypses, because the world isn't technically completely destroyed. The Norse believed in a cyclical model of time, so Ragnarok was seen as a cataclysmic time period that would lead to the renewal of the earth. So first the world would freeze, then the world would burn, then it would flood, and then it would regenerate. And this 3-step process fits really well with what the Tsaritsa is trying to do. Project Stuzha is the freezing portion. Then she wants to burn away the old world. And no, we don't have a mention of a flood yet, but we do know that she wants to create a whole new world. And I think the key to this plan working is the resurrection of the third Descender. And I think that because Arlecchino did mention one more interesting detail about Project Stuzha, and that is the fact that Child will play a very important role in it. And based on this, I can only assume that the Tsaritsa intends to use Child as a vessel for the remains of the third Descender once they've been extracted from the gnosis. This Project Stuzha will freeze Tevat in place for a while. Perhaps it won't even be technically frozen in ice, but frozen in time. Maybe along the same lines as what the Abyss Twin did in the Space and Time for You quest. And maybe the burning portion is the incineration of memories. Kind of like how Arlecchino's Bale Moon Bloodfire works, or like how Dottore is shown burning down this tree of memories. Now remember, I started off this theory talking about Reed Miller and the legend of the Sampo. And I did it for a good reason, because I think that the story of Reed Miller is basically a preview of Project Stuzha. I think that once he's made into a proper vessel of the third descender, Child will possess the attributes necessary to become the noble sacred heir who can use the Sampo to create an Elysium, specifically the Tsaritsa's Elysium, which in this case is a brand new world. In this way, Child becomes an artificial descender, one who can create the world and destroy the world and thus becomes king of the new world. But this leaves one question unresolved. Just what is the Sampo in this scenario? Well, Nod-Krai's Sampo is basically a blend of Descender and Dragon technology that's capable of restructuring matter or transmuting it at the very least. We can think of it as a creation device or a Genesis engine. Likewise, the most common depiction of the mythological Sampo in the Kalevala also labels it as a device of creation. But that Sampo is a lot more limited because it can only create grain, gold, and salt. But that is not the case outside of the Kalevala. The issue with using the Kalevala as our only source of Finnish folklore is that the Kalevala was written by a single man, Elias Lönnrot, and he took a lot of artistic liberties when compiling this collection of runic songs into one linear narrative. And when you start investigating and looking beyond the Kalevala, you'll start to see that the Sampo's original form isn't as simple as just a hand mill that makes infinite gold and grain. Because the Sampo is another name for the pillar of the world, and I mean that quite literally. In some of the oldest sources, the Sampo was something like the world's axis. It was a giant pillar that would connect the depths of the earth to the dome of the sky, allowing the world to rotate around a fixed point, and that point was the polar star, or the pole star, which is located in the northern lands of Pohjola. And I'm pretty sure this is why Child has the signature weapon of the polar star. I'm pretty sure this is the same star as the pale star that the Tsaritsa uses as her symbol. I think it's all just the pole star, the ending of the world's axis. But this is why another name for the Sampo is Kirokansi, a name that means speckled lib and describes the great dome of the sky, specifically the night sky, because it's the lid of the earth that's speckled with stars. And in this context, the entire world was considered to be the Sampo. The entire world was the cosmic mill that generated fertility and prosperity. The word Sampo was generally used just to describe the handle around which the mill turned. It was the name for the world's axis, the Axis Mundi. Now, Genshin also has an Axis Mundi that is also called the Pillar of the World. It's Irminsul, and that shouldn't surprise anybody because that name literally means Great Pillar. And this Great Pillar is one of the sources of life in Teyvat. So if we follow this interpretation of the Sampo, a few things become a lot clearer. First off, the reason why the creator of Nod-Krai's Sampo, Voyager, borrows the name of the Finnish fertility god Sampsa is because Sampsa is credited as being the creator of all trees, and in this case, the Sampo would be a tree. So Voyager's matter restructuring Sampo is likely related to the purpose and ability of a seed capable of producing an Irminsul. Which leads me to the second point of clarity, which we can find in the myth of Ragnarok, because according to the Voluspa, the two humans who survived Ragnarok and lived on to repopulate the New World did so by taking refuge in Hodmimi's Halt. Now, Hodmimi's Halt is typically thought of as a forest, but many scholars argue that Hodmimi's Halt is actually an alternate name for Yggdrasil, the world tree, the Irminsul. And since Teyvat's Irminsul is a repository of memories, we can assume that this is also Hodmimi's Halt, where you put all of the stuff that you want to save and carry over into the new world. And with that in mind, I think it's quite possible that the Tsaritsa's plan is to recreate an artificial descender from the remains of the third by using Child as a vessel. This is Project Stuzha, aka Fimbulvetter, the prelude to the apocalypse, to Ragnarok. And following Child becoming Descender number 3.5, he will become the new noble sacred heir capable of interfacing with a Sampo, aka a world tree, or the seed of a world tree. Now, based on previously mentioned dialogue, I assume that the next step is to burn away the old world, or burn down the current Irminsul, or burn down the unwanted memories. Then you plant the seed of the new Irminsul in its remains, or you use some sort of Sampo matter restructuring device to take the old material and recombine it into something new. In this way, the Sampo becomes a seed that will initiate Genesis and recreate the world at the hands of the Descender in charge. And in light of that, I can't help but wonder if this Sampo Seed Genesis object isn't the Genesis Pearl from the Battle Pass. Because a pearl of Genesis sounds a bit like a stone of creation, and a raven stone is a magic stone born from an egg, and eggs are objects of creation, of birth. And in Finnish mythology, the world, and especially the sky, was born from the shattering of an egg, which is why the raven stone and the egg of the worldly creation are things that are often associated with each other. So if we think of the Genesis pearl as a raven stone, and the raven stone is something like the Sampo or related to it, and Reed Miller is associated with ravens and thus the raven stone, and also is an allegory for the third descender, then I think we can probably guess at the identity of the two heirs from the battle pass now, can't we? I could keep going for a long time, but I think we'll leave it there. So thank you all for watching. Don't forget to drop by Roosevelt's channel. There's a link below, and we'll catch you all in the next video. Bye-bye! What, you're still here? Well, I'm not really sure what you want me to say. I mean, this theory is technically over. We already got to the part where child is a vessel for the third descender, and I mean, that's what you came here for, right? Oh, so you felt like something was missing from this theory, huh? I see your point. I mean, it does feel like I've kind of glossed over one odd piece of Reed Miller's tale and its relationship to the third descenders. So, all right then. I mean, I think I still have a little bit of crack left in the pot, so how about this? Do you remember how Lovia was originally trying to force the birth of the sacred heir but failed because Reed Miller was born elsewhere, potentially to parents who didn't even belong to the Frostmoon Scions? Well, if you take that scenario and superimpose it onto the Tsaritsa's plan, then the Tsaritsa in this situation is Lovia, because she's trying to force the rebirth of the sacred heir, the third descender in this case, her own personal Reed Miller. And if that's the case, then we have to consider the possibility that the Tsaritsa will fail or has already failed, just like Lovia, because the noble sacred heir may have already been reborn elsewhere, specifically in Inazuma. Now hear me out, because I know this is going to sound crazy. I mean, you stuck around for the crackpot theory, okay? This is your fault, not mine. So a few months ago, I read a few theories about how Wanderer might be a reincarnation of the third descender, and to say I was skeptical would be an understatement. But I must admit, not only were those theories really fun to read, but they had a lot of very compelling evidence, so the idea just kind of stuck with me. Not because I subscribed to it, but because it was really memorable. But after I finished writing this theory, I realized that Wanderer actually meets most, if not all, of the third descender criteria that I laid out in this video, none of which was in any of those other theories. The full list would take far too long to go over, so consider this incomplete cherry-picked list. Wanderer has noble origins since he's the creation of a god, and much like the Traveler who is a descender, he is very resistant, if not impervious, to abyssal influence, which is part of the reason why Piero used to send him on abyss expeditions. In fact, he's even compatible with forbidden knowledge, which is also known as divine knowledge. He's also been through the cycle of death and rebirth, potentially several times, depending on how you look at things. And his latest name, Wanderer, matches thematically with the other descenders' pseudonyms, Traveler and Voyager. Wanderer was also born on an island, which makes him an islander, which matches with the third descender's name of Saarelainen. And while he might not fight a whale, he does confront a dragon, much like Aias did, and he even makes a friend out of them. And also, that dragon was targeting stars, just like the star-swallowing whale of Reed Miller and the star-swallowing whale that Child fought. And although it was just in his boss form, Wanderer does appear to be able to wield all 7 elements, just like the Traveler. Well, it's only 7 if you include this ground pound move that matches Ether and Lumine's Geo Burst as a representation of the Geo element. It's a little suspicious either way. Additionally, Wanderer can directly interface with Irminsul, which I've argued is a type of Sampo. And despite being a mechanical construction and the prototype for the Shogun who required programming and instructions, Wanderer woke up fully sentient, as if he already possessed a complete soul. And just like Lemminkainen, Wanderer was pieced together by his mother, who may or may not have been trying to reconstruct her dead sister, or at least she was trying to create a puppet in her own image in order to cope with the grief. And it's also suspicious that Wanderer's constellation is called Peregrinus, which means outlander or traveler. And that same constellation is of his humanoid self, and this is a treatment reserved only for the traveler and gods who have possessed a gnosis. And the icing on this theoretical cake is that Wanderer believed the gnosis was his heart, which raises a question. What if the gnosis was his heart? A representation of his birthright, the control module to his Sampo. Like, what if some residual fragment of the third descender jumped into Wanderer's empty vessel, and the tears he cried were from the lingering memory of his own death? As far as we know, he's only ever interacted with the Electro-Gnosis. So maybe if he were to interact with other Gnosis, he'd have other reactions. Maybe he would recover other fragments of that previous self. Is that far-fetched? Maybe. But it is worth noting that A appears to have made him from the wood of a silver tree. And whenever you see someone talk about a silver tree, they're almost always referring to Irminsul, which means that Wanderer was carved from the wood of Irminsul. He was reborn from the tree. If the world tree is the Sampo, then you see where the connection happens, right? I also find it really interesting that Wanderer has offered his loyalty to a keeper of that same silver tree, Nahida, because their relationship is kind of similar to Voyager and Koitar, because Koitar was also shackled and lived at the base of a silver tree. Granted, Wanderer and Nahida don't have a romantic relationship, but Wanderer has still pledged loyalty to Nahida in the same way that Child has pledged loyalty to the Saritsa. If Child's relationship counts, then I think Wanderer's does too. And maybe this next bit means nothing, but in Simulanka, Wanderer was the hero of prophecy, not the traveler. He even got his own Sword of Reason with the hero's blade that he couldn't throw away. And in the Nartzenkreuz quest, the Sword of Reason was supposed to be the marker of a descender. Simulanka also labeled Wanderer a hero from another world, which is a title unique to him, despite the fact that Navia, Kirara, Nilu, and the Traveler were all from another world. Nilu was very notably called the Forest Fairy, not the Forest Fairy from another world. Now, this whole thing could just be one complex metaphor for the Traveler's story, but if it is, then it doesn't explain why Wanderer's birthplace, the Shake Pavilion, has a description that reads, "Deep within these rocky mountains is a site that does not belong to this world." The only thing this description can be referring to is Wanderer. He's the only thing that was kept in that pavilion. If he's not related to the Descenders, then why is it referring to him as something that should not belong to this world? And I think when you view things from this angle, Dotori's initial interest in Wanderer becomes much more suspicious, especially since he placed him at the center of the Artificial God Project in Sumeru. Was Dotori just doing a test run for Project Stuzha? You know, using him as a prototype for Descender Child? Or does Dotori have other plans for Wanderer, separate from the Saritsa? I mean, Dotori is the one that we see burning down Irminsul in that one trailer. And that's the part of Ragnarok that follows Fimbulvetr, you know, Project Stuzha. And if Wanderer really is connected to all of this, then maybe that's why Pyro sent him on all those missions to the Abyss, and why he sent him to learn about the truth of the false sky all those years ago. At this point, the only trait of the third Descender that Wanderer lacks is the name Aias, but you know, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that means he's not bound to meet the same fate as all the other Aiases. After all, there's a fourth Descender in this time period, so maybe it's their turn to reimagine the world. Honestly, I don't know how realistic this idea is in the grand scheme of things. When dealing with such a breadth of parallels and links between all sorts of different aspects of the game throughout many years, it's really hard to tell the difference between patterns that appear organically and the writer's true intentions. Like, I could do this all day, I really could. I could spend time linking Wanderer to birds, which is something I can't really do with Child, and I could even stretch the limits. I could point out the fact that Wanderer has a speckled lid, just like a Sampo. It's his hat. He's got a hat, it's a speckled lid. Get it? It's a cool link, but does it actually mean anything, or is it just a coincidence? I don't really know. I don't think any of us can know. But to me, it doesn't really matter in the end. I just enjoy linking things together and exploring all of the cool ideas that I can possibly find, and I thought this one was pretty cool. Cool ideas are what make theorizing so fun in the first place, so just, don't take this too seriously, okay? Anyway, I am done for real this time. I really hope that you enjoyed this interesting twist on an idea that many people have been bouncing around lately. I had a ton of fun writing this theory and reading about Finnish mythology, and I like sharing the fun. I want to say a quick thanks to all my channel members for putting up with my nonsense and being very patient with me. Another very special thanks to Roosevelt for stepping in and helping me edit this on such short notice. And if you enjoyed her work, you should totally go and subscribe to her channel. There's a link in the description. Okay, I think I gotta wrap this up and move on to the next thing. So thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there. Bye-bye.